I'm here to teach you about thinking and intelligence, Chapter 7. Let's start by defining cognition. Cognition is basically thinking. It involves perception, knowledge, problem solving, judgment, language, and memory. We're going to talk a lot about language today and problem solving, and there's a whole chapter about memory coming up. Scientists who study cognition are searching for ways to understand how we integrate, organize, and utilize our conscious cognitive experiences without being aware of all the unconscious work that our brains are doing. I personally find cognition very interesting, and I hope you do too. Cognitive psychology is the field of psychology dedicated to examining how people think. It starts with the information, which comes in through our senses. Those get turned into emotions and memories, which are then turned into thoughts. Those thoughts, of course, influence our emotions and memories. And finally, the thoughts result in behavior. So this path here is sort of like the steps of cognition. The information comes in, we create emotions and memories, or it stimulates emotions and memories, which create thoughts. That's an interactive process. And finally, all that results in our behavior. Emotion and memory are powerful influences on our thoughts and our behaviors. This kind of sums up what cognitive psychology really is. So let's get into how we perceive things to start with. We talked about how cognition involves perception and the way that we organize those perceptions in our mind. One important concept is concepts. Concepts are categories or groupings, big ideas generated by observing details and categorizing and combining these details into cognitive structures. The picture below shows some kids playing in the snow. Now, I grew up in Canada, so my concept of snow is kind of that it can be a pain in the neck and get all over your car and prevent you from doing your errands. But I also remember rolling big snowballs and building snow forts and having snowball fights and sledding and all of those things that you do in the snow. All of that encompasses my concept of snow. If you grew up in Hawaii, your concept of snow might be more related to Christmas and movies or vacations, but you still have a general concept of what snow is. So that's a concept. A prototype, on the other hand, is the best example or representation of the concept. So the concept of chair may include office chairs and beach chairs, dining chairs, folding chairs, kid-sized chairs, school desk chairs. But when I ask you to think of a chair, you likely think of a dining chair similar to the one I posted a picture of here. That's a prototype of chair. Your prototype is affected by your experiences in life. So maybe you didn't think of this kind of chair. Maybe the prototype of chair in your mind is a beach chair because you've spent more time at the beach than you have sitting at a table eating. Anyhow, the prototype is the best example of this concept. So one more time, we can see all the different types of dogs. Those are specific examples of dogs. But the prototype is what that person thinks of as a general dog. It may not be a real dog, like in this example. It's sort of a cartoon picture of a dog. But that's the prototype, when you say dog, that this person thinks of, even though they can recognize all the different breeds as dogs themselves. So here's another example. All of those different kinds of chairs that you may be thinking of when I say chair. But when I say chair, you probably have a prototype in your mind that comes from that larger concept or schema of chairs. One more example with the cats. Sorry, I like my examples. I do find prototypes very interesting. That when I say cat, probably most of you would think of the cat in the top right, a regular house cat. But perhaps you have a hairless cat, or your auntie does and you grew up with one and you thought of a hairless cat when someone says picture a cat. Or maybe you even think of a lion or a tiger when somebody asks you to picture a cat. Everybody has different prototypes, but of course there are some that are more common than others. A schema is a mental construct consisting of a cluster or collection of related concepts. So a schema is sort of like that all of those chairs that you were thinking of was the schema of chair. And then you can think of one example, a prototype that is the best example of that schema of chairs. A role schema describes a person's role. In this example, the firefighter. If somebody tells you that they're a firefighter, you probably assume that they're fairly able-bodied and strong and brave and hardworking. While this may not all be true, it likely is at least partly true. And these role schemas can be about people, not just about their occupations, about different types of people, even about genders or age, all different types of role schemas that we have in our minds about people. And event schemas, which are also called a cognitive script, are sort of like a set of rules that let us know what to follow in a specific event. In this picture, they're in an elevator, and as usual, everybody faces the doors in the elevator because that's part of our event schema. We have many different event schemas in our mind. When we go to a birthday party, we often drop off the gift right at the beginning and say hello to the guests, and we don't expect to have cake until later in the day. We don't usually eat cake right when we arrive at a birthday party. All of this is our event schema for birthday parties. I find role schemas and event schemas very interesting, especially how they can differ between different cultures. Okay, so now we've talked about the area of cognition where we're organizing things in our mind. We talked about concepts and prototypes and schemas. Now let's move on to language, which is going to kind of be the majority of this chapter. Language is a communication system that involves using words and systematic rules to transmit information from one individual to another. So language, of course, can be spoken or written or signed. Lexicon are the words of a given language, the vocabulary: dog, swimming, blue, big, even words like it, and, or. All of these are part of our lexicon in English. Of course, sign languages and written language have lexicon as well. Grammar is the set of rules that are used to convey meaning through the use of lexicon. So lexicon are just a bunch of random words. Every single word, like reading a dictionary. A dictionary is a list of all of our lexicon. But the grammar are the rules with which we put those words together to make meaning out of them. When you read the dictionary, it doesn't mean anything, a page of the dictionary, all of those words in a row. We need to put them together in a specific order using grammar so that they make sense. Taking a step back for a minute, let's break down those words, break down that lexicon into phonemes. Phonemes are actually sounds which cannot be broken down into smaller sounds. So not a blend like BR or ST together, but every single sound that's just a sound on its own, like the P sound or the M sound, or sounds like a, ooh, ow. All of those are phonemes, sounds that don't mean anything. They're just sounds on their own. Of course, a few phonemes mean something like I and a. We combine the phonemes, which are basically letters or pairs of letters that make a sound, like SH makes the sh sound. We can combine those phonemes to make morphemes. Morphemes are sometimes words, but they're often just parts of words, but they have meaning. In these examples here of morphemes, we see pre, graph, and ing. All three of those morphemes have meaning. We know that pre means come before, graph, and then ing is added to a verb. Semi means partially. We know a phobia is a fear, and comes after a word to show us that the person is doing it, right? A farmer is farming, and a teacher is teaching. We know what means, and we know what pre means, or ing, or semi, even though they're not words on their own. Graph and phobia are words on their own, as well as being morphemes. I hope this makes sense. Let me review it one more time really quick. Phonemes are the sounds that cannot be broken down, and we put the phonemes together to make morphemes, which have meaning, but sometimes are not words on their own, such as pre or semi. So that now we can use those morphemes to create words, our lexicon, which are put together with grammar, and syntax. Syntax is a type of grammar, which is the way the words are organized into sentences, the order that we put things in. For example, in English, we normally put the describing word before the noun, the adjective before the noun. We say a blue ball or a big dog, not a ball blue or a dog big. So syntax is the way that words are organized into sentences, and then the semantics are the actual meanings of the words themselves, or even the meanings of the morphemes. So these are the general components of language: our lexicon, grammar, phoneme, morpheme, syntax, and semantics. Moving on to language development, I find this part very interesting. As people age, the ease with which they acquire and master new language diminishes, which is to say that it's easier to learn a new language when you're younger. In fact, before the age of about 11, if you learn a new language, you won't have an accent in that language, a second language type of accent. If you learn the language after age 11, there's a good chance you'll always have an accent that might tip people off to knowing that it's not your first language. So as you get older, it's harder to learn a new language, but it's never impossible. It doesn't mean you cannot learn a new language as an adult. However, newborns are prime for language. Babies are just like little language sponges ready to figure out this whole language thing. Newborns show preference for their mother's voice right when they're born, and they appear to be able to discriminate between the language spoken by their mother and other languages. So while they're in the mother's uterus during the pregnancy, they can hear sounds from the outside, and by the time they're born, they already show a preference for the language that they were hearing during the pregnancy. Babies also show preference for videos of faces that are moving in sync with the audio of the spoken language. So you know how sometimes the audio and video on a TV show or movie gets off, gets mixed up, it's off, and then their mouth isn't moving at the right time? Just like you don't like it, babies don't like that either. They already have an ingrained preference to watch people's mouths moving when they listen to speech. Infants can discriminate between the sounds of all human languages. However, by about a year old, they can only discriminate amongst the phonemes used in the language or languages in their own environment. So they're born with the ability to hear and discriminate between all possible phonemes, but by a year old, they've lost that ability for any phonemes that they haven't been hearing. They can only discriminate between phonemes and sounds that they're hearing in the language or languages that their parents or caregivers speak. Babbling is when babies repeat syllables, which become more complex over time. It starts as a real simple ba, 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 or ma, 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 ma. And they get a little more complex with time. And this part is cool. Just, two things that are cool. One is that they're just as likely to babble alone as they are with others, which suggests that it's more about practicing their speech and practicing moving their mouth and their tongue than it is about trying to communicate. So they're not trying to communicate, or they wouldn't do it as much when they were alone. The second really interesting thing about babbling is that babies who grow up in sign language environments babble with gestures. They do something similar, repeated movements with their hands, sort of like sign language babbling. I thought that was cool. One more definition: overgeneralization is applying a grammatical rule to the exceptions. This is common in children when they're learning language. For example, saying mouses instead of mice, or saying, yesterday I swimmed at my friend's house, because we're applying that rule of putting an S for plural or ED for past tense to all the words, and not the young children are not able to notice the exceptions. So they do what's called overgeneralization. All right, moving on from language to problem solving. Let me take a quick sip of water. All right. 3 types of problem solving that we're going to learn about. The first is called trial and error. In trial and error, you're trying to solve a problem by just continuously trying different solutions until you solve your problem. The picture example shows a baby with a shape sorter. Often this is how those shape sorters are solved by babies, is with trial and error. They take the shape and try and stick it into all the different holes until they find one that fits. The example in the chart says, if your phone is not working, you may start by restarting it, then you'll turn off your Wi-Fi, then you'll turn off your Bluetooth, trying one thing at a time to see what works. Trial and error is not the most useful, and it's certainly not the most time-efficient way to solve a problem, but it's a very common way that people solve their problems. An algorithm is a more guaranteed way to solve your problem, but it can take longer or be harder to find. An algorithm is a step-by-step problem-solving formula. Basically, if you Google how to do something, they tell you with an algorithm. First do this, then do that, next do this. In the example in the middle here, the picture example, it's telling you the lamp doesn't work. So you follow this algorithm. You check if it's plugged in first. If it's not, plug it in. If it is plugged in, check the light bulb. If it's burnt out, replace it. If not, buy a new lamp. That algorithm will work every time, but it might not be always the best way of solving your problem, or it might not be available. Not everybody might know this algorithm. But if you have an algorithm, it's usually best to use it. Finally, a heuristic is a general problem-solving framework, such as working backwards or breaking things into steps. There's common uses for heuristics. People use heuristics to reduce the mental effort needed to make their decisions, simplify a complex decision. People like to use heuristics because they're an accurate and fast way to arrive at a conclusion. So heuristics can definitely be a good thing. But there's also problems that we can have when we use heuristics for problem solving. One problem is a mental set. A mental set is where you persist in approaching a problem in the way that worked in the past, but is clearly not working now. So the book gave an example of if there's 4 doors that you can use to exit the room and you normally use one, that door is locked. The person may continuously try that door without looking at the other 3 doors or attempting to open the other 3 doors because they're so used to using that door. So you just keep trying to solve the problem the way you used to. And this is related to functional fixedness, which is a type of mental set where you cannot perceive the object being used for anything else. So if I'm used to using forks to eat with, I can't imagine brushing my hair with a fork, although it may work. The examples in the pictures, the first one on the left is a famous experiment that they used to demonstrate functional fixedness. They gave people a couple thumbtacks and a box of matches and a candle, and they were supposed to affix the candle to the wall using those materials. The box of matches, the box itself was actually a very important part of this challenge, but many people didn't see the box as being a tool. They thought the matches were the tool, and the box was simply there to hold the matches and strike them against. We needed to sort of think outside the box and use the box that the matches came in. But functional fixedness might have prevented people from doing that. The funny meme of the guy in the hoodie says he's avoiding functional fixedness by using the pot cover as a mask of sorts inside his hood. Of course, it's not safe, and I don't recommend it, but it made me laugh, so I put it in there. The string problem that you can see, Myers' 2-string problem, is very interesting to me. I actually showed this to my 11-year-old son, who immediately said the guy should take off his shoes and tie them to the strings to make them longer. I thought that was interesting, an interesting solution. In fact, the solution they were looking for here was to tie the paint can to one of the strings and swing it like a pendulum so that the man was able to grab the second string. The point of this being that functional fixedness might stop people from solving it, whether it was with my son's shoe suggestion or the researcher's paint can suggestion. if we're used to thinking of shoes as something that go on our feet and a paint can as something we use to keep paint in, we might not think of them as rope extenders or pendulum swingers, pendulum weights. And that's functional fixedness. And of course, using the hammer as a paperweight instead of a hammer is an example of using something for a purpose other than what it was designed for. More issues with problem solving, different types of bias. Let's start with anchoring bias. Anchoring bias makes us depend too heavily on one specific piece of information when we're making our judgments. So a common example of anchoring bias is like this picture here where they show 75% off. This shirt is only $250. They're making us pay attention to the sale and pay attention to that first price, so the next price seems cheap. All we're thinking about is that first price. They're anchoring us in on the $1,000 shirt, so the $250 seems cheap in comparison. Of course, if we saw that shirt advertised for $100 and then we saw this board, we wouldn't be interested. It would look expensive. That's anchoring bias. Representative bias has to do with our stereotypes, our personal stereotypes that may be common or may not be. This example here asks you to guess which of the individuals is a Harvard grad, and as you can see, it's the girl on the left, not the guy on the right. The guy on the right, it says, is a smart dude, but he didn't go to Harvard. And the woman on the left is a Sports Illustrated swimsuit model, as well as a economics major at Harvard University. But perhaps just by looking at their pictures, you might have guessed that it was in fact the man who went to Harvard, not only because he's a man, but because of his clothes he's wearing and his glasses and the way that he looks and the preconceived stereotypes that we have. This is representative bias. The next one on the top is the availability heuristic. This is what happens when things that come to mind easily, either because they were a really big deal or they were emotional or because they were recent and just happened, those things that come to mind easily have an overwhelming impact on our thoughts and on our cognition and our way to solve problems. So in the example, it says that it's easy to recall something like a plane crash, whereas it's harder to recall all the safe flights that go on. This could lead to a fear in flying, right? It's easy to recall winning the lottery. It's not as easy to recall all the tickets you bought and lost, so you might buy more lottery tickets. Of course, this is a problem-solving bias that we think more and value more the things that happened recently or the things that stand out in our mind. On to the bottom, the Dilbert comic. I'll read it to you. She says, "Let's begin the meeting, but be aware that I'm documenting all of your bullying behavior." So then he says, I'm not even close to being a bully, but now your confirmation bias will make everything I say sound like bullying to you. To which she says, "Can you repeat the part after you implied that I'm a delusional witch?" So we can see she's already succumbing to her confirmation bias. She's already seeing everything he says as bullying. We talked in an earlier chapter about observation bias. Remember when the researcher is observing somebody and they have a preconceived notion and what they are watching is affected by what they were expecting to happen. This is the same thing. Confirmation bias is sort of like an expectancy bias. You think you know what's going on, so you only see information that supports what you think. And finally, hindsight bias makes you feel like you knew what was going on all along. I knew he was trouble when I met him. Yeah, then why'd you keep hanging out with him, right? These guys are saying, even though we helped him build it, I always knew it was a bad idea, right? I knew that was going to happen. That's hindsight bias. You didn't really know it was going to happen. You might have had a feeling or an inkling which sticks out to you now that it really did happen. But hindsight bias is when you didn't really know something before, but in hindsight you think you did. All right, we're done with problem solving. On to intelligence. Moving our way through this chapter. Crystallized intelligence is acquired knowledge and the ability to retrieve it. So anything that's in there in your long-term memory, or the intelligence that you've learned, anything you've learned that you can retrieve, is crystallized intelligence. Whereas fluid intelligence is the ability to see complex relationships and solve problems. It's more of a in the moment type of thing. The triarchic theory of intelligence talks about 3 different types of intelligence. Creative intelligence, which is imaginative and innovative problem solving. Analytical intelligence, which is academic problem solving and computation. And practical intelligence, more like common sense and street smarts. So the triarchic theory of intelligence talks about these 3 types of intelligence. However, Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences talks about 8 different types of intelligence: visual, musical, kinesthetic, interpersonal, linguistic, mathematical, naturalistic, and intrapersonal. It's important to notice the difference between intrapersonal and interpersonal. Intrapersonal is intelligence about yourself, understanding yourself, whereas interpersonal is a social intelligence, being people smart. You can look at the picture in case you're not familiar with any of these other words, like kinesthetic means an intelligence with your body. A gymnast has very high kinesthetic intelligence, whereas a singer or a musician, of course, would have high musical intelligence, and an artist or a photographer would have high visual intelligence. Creativity is a type of intelligence as well. It's related. Creativity is the ability to generate, create, or discover new ideas, solutions, and possibilities. And as you can imagine, creativity is an important aspect of intelligence. There are 2 types of thinking related to being creative: convergent thinking and divergent thinking. Divergent thinking is more thinking outside the box. You start with your issue and your ideas move away from it. You're thinking outside the box. Things like collaborative projects, there's lots of different answers. Both of these ways are good, but divergent thinking can sort of lead to more varied solutions to a problem. Whereas convergent thinking really just has a specific solution in mind, and you're trying to figure out how to get to that specific solution. It's more linear. Things like worksheets. There's right answers versus no right answers. So with divergent thinking, there's not really a right answer. You have your problem and your solutions just go in every which way to see what works. It's very more creative. Convergent thinking is really less creative and more systematic, where you have your solution in mind and you just need to figure out how to get there. I like that they put the colors for the divergent thinking, all the different colored arrows, and for convergent thinking, all the arrows are the same color. That kind of explains the essence of it. We're getting there. We're almost done. I do want to talk about why measures of intelligence can be a bad thing. Measures of intelligence like IQ can tell us how smart we are, in quotes, right? But measures of intelligence are not infallible. There are lots of issues with them, including cultural issues and language issues. If you're taking the test and it's not your first language, or it's not in the culture that you grew up in, you may score lower than your true intelligence. But another big issue with measures of intelligence is the type of discrimination that can go on against people who score low on these measures of intelligence. A very important Supreme Court case was Buck versus Bell, where a young girl named Carrie Buck was actually sterilized. She could not have any more kids. She'd had one baby, and they said that her mother was mentally deficient and she was mentally deficient and her first baby was mentally deficient. So they sterilized her, made her not able to have any more kids. And the judge, as you can see on the right, was quoted as saying, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So they thought that this was a good reason to tell somebody that they could not procreate, they could not have babies, that they're not smart enough to do so. And of course, this was determined using these tests that we all know are problematic to begin with. So Buck versus Bell was a very big case, and in fact, the Supreme Court ruled that it was not unconstitutional to sterilize her. So they upheld the ability to sterilize people due to low intelligence. And only all the way, so that was back in 1924, and all the way in 2014 in Hall versus Florida did the Supreme Court finally decide that IQ scores, oh, I'm sorry, it's related to the other court case. Forget Hall versus Florida. Go back to Buck versus Bell. I apologize. They did not overturn the ability to sterilize people with low intelligence. And in fact, it never really got overturned. But there was another case later. I don't have it on this slide. There was another case later where they were not able to sterilize the person, but it still didn't overturn Buck versus Bell. So that was a big issue back in 1924. I apologize for the confusion about the 2014 case. Let's move on to that now, starting with the Darrell Atkins case in 2002, where Atkins versus Virginia, his lawyers were saying that his intelligence was too low for him to be held responsible for the murder that he committed, or at least that he shouldn't be put to death because his intelligence was so low. So they were saying that it was cruel and unusual punishment to put him to death with the death penalty, and that the Eighth Amendment should protect him due to his low intelligence. And at the time that was passed, he went to jail, but he didn't end up with the death penalty. However, Hall versus Florida, this is the one that happened in 2014, the Supreme Court decided at that point that IQ scores cannot be the only deciding factor in the death penalty. So with Atkins, they said because his IQ was so low, he automatically could not be put to death. Whereas 12 years later, in the case in Florida, they said that you can include IQ in the decision of whether somebody deserves the death penalty, but it cannot be the only deciding factor. Anyhow, all of these three Supreme Court cases are three examples of how measures of intelligence can be used in life or death situations. And that's why we really need to be sure that at least we're doing it right. So let's look at how we measure intelligence. There are two main intelligence tests that are still used today. There's the Stanford-Binet test and the Wechsler test. The Wechsler test, there's an adult version and a child version. These are examples from both. The top two, I believe, are from the adult version of the Wechsler test. The bottom on the left, we have the Stanford-Binet, and on the right, we have the WISC, which is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, WISC. As a teacher who works with learning disabled students, I am familiar with the WISC. I cannot perform it myself. I'm not certified to do that, but I know many people who are, and I understand the results when I look at them, and it's actually quite a good test for many students, not for all, and it should not be used as a guarantee that what score they get is what they should really get. In fact, I'll go on a quick tangent real quick and tell you about a student I worked with once, one of the smartest boys I've ever met, high school student. He and I would have political discussions and historical discussions, and he knew so much, and he had such wonderful opinions. And when I took a look at his intelligence test, he scored with an IQ of 4, which is not even high enough to be able to use the bathroom on your own or get dressed. And like I said, this was one of the smartest people I've ever met. Obviously, he either didn't take the test seriously or there was some type of malfunction. But that was just a very stark example to me of how you cannot just look at somebody's score on a piece of paper and assume that that's their intelligence. But if you like to take intelligence tests like I do, they're actually kind of fun to do the puzzles, and that's why I posted some of the pictures on here as an example. But you don't really need to know that much about the measures of intelligence, other than that they can be culturally exclusive. Many people score lower if they're not in the culture where it was created, meaning basically if they're not white, that they score lower because this is a test that was created by white people for white people, tested on white people. So when you give it to people of other races or nationalities or cultures, it's not necessarily applicable. Moving on to the bell curve. The bell curve is very famous for how it represents intelligence. It can be used for lots of things, including height and many other things. As soon as something is normed, and as soon as it's normed, which we'll talk about in a moment, it fits into the bell curve. A bell curve basically just shows the average. So here they're showing the Wechsler intelligence score, basically an IQ. It's showing average 100 right in the middle. The very, very average person gets 100, with 34% of people scoring 15 points within that 15-point range lower, and another 34% scoring within that 15-point range higher. Those are the standard deviations that they're showing there. So as you can see, 68% of people fall into that range of IQ between 85 and 115, meaning it's very rare to fall outside of that. And in fact, 95% fall into that range between 70 and 130, meaning less than 2% of people have a genius IQ and less than 2% of people have an IQ less than 70, which is considered a mentally deficient or developmentally disabled IQ. But again, this is only according to that test, which is not always perfect. So is intelligence nature or nurture? Nature means how you were born, and nurture means how you were brought up. Some people say that intelligence is a trait inherited from a person's parent. This is the nature view. Others say that intelligence is shaped by a child's developmental environment. This is the nurture view. Twin studies are often used to try and pull apart how much of who we are is our nature and how much is our nurture. And twins who were reared apart, meaning brought up apart, separated at birth, those are the best people to study because they have the same genes, but they were brought up in a different environment. So as you can see by the data on the left, the more genes shared, the more correlation there is between somebody's IQ, right? Starting at the bottom, people who don't share any genes at all, adoptive siblings or children raised together or adoptive parent and child, hardly have any correlation between their IQs. There's not a big relationship between the child's IQ and the parent's IQ or the siblings' IQs. Even though they grew up together, there's not a huge correlation because there's no genes shared. Let's look at half siblings. They only share 25% of their genes. They have slightly more percent correlation with the IQ than the adoptive siblings, but not really, right? So this is sort of teasing apart the nature and nurture here, right? Adoptive siblings were nurtured together. Half siblings were nurtured together and share a little bit of genes. Parent-child pairs and fraternal twins all share 50% of their genes, and look at how high their correlation is with IQ. But look interestingly at the last one, identical twins that were raised apart. They share 100% of their genes because they're identical twins, but no environmental factors. They were raised in different families, and they still have more than a 75% correlation between their IQs. So this shows that intelligence really is based a lot on our nature, based on our genes, how we were born. But of course, we have the reaction range theory over here on the right, which we talked about in a previous chapter, where it shows that yes, we are born with our intelligence, but that intelligence is a range. And where we fall on that range depends on our environment. I explained this in the previous chapter, so I won't go too far into it. Let's just look real quickly at Jill in the bottom middle. Jill has a range of intelligence that she was born with, but she ended up low on that range because she was in a deprived environment. She would have ended up higher on that range if she were brought up in an enriched environment. So nature and nurture both contribute to our intelligence, but we really have this restricted range that we're born with in the first place, and then we can move within that range depending on our environment. All right, last slide before our summary. This one might take a little bit because it's something that is near and dear to my heart, which are learning disabilities. I work with many students who have learning disabilities. Some of these people are the smartest people I have ever met. It would blow you away to hear the things that come out of these little kids' mouths, how insightful and how logical and how good they are at solving problems. Some of these little kids can draw better than anything, but they get to fourth or fifth grade and they can still barely read. And it's heartbreaking because everybody in the class thinks that they're dumb. They think they're not smart because they're in fifth grade and they can't read anything. And everything in school has to do with reading. Math is about reading, social studies, everything. You have to read the instructions to play a board game. And when somebody can't read, people often assume that their intelligence is low, when in fact, dyslexic people often have higher intelligence than the average person. All that to say, let's actually first define dysgraphia real quick. Dysgraphia is impaired letter writing by hand or disabled handwriting. So this is not dyslexia yet. This is dysgraphia, two different things. People with dysgraphia have impaired handwriting, impaired spelling, but without reading problems because it's not dyslexia, it's dysgraphia. Or sometimes both handwriting and spelling. So dysgraphia is a learning disability related to writing, either with your handwriting, how legible it is, or with your spelling, or with both. But it's different than dyslexia because it's not a reading disability. People with dysgraphia can read just fine. Their problem is with writing. You may know a dysgraphic person if you can think of somebody who can read and enjoys reading, but if they make a grocery list, you can't even tell what they've written on there. They're likely dysgraphic. Dyslexia is slightly more complicated to understand. Let me start by reading you the definition from the International Dyslexia Association. It says, dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It's how you are born with something in your brain. Your brain looks the same, but the way it functions is a little different. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. So seeing sight words often is inaccurate. Reading sight words can be inaccurate or slow. Poor spelling and poor decoding abilities, meaning sounding out words. So somebody who's dyslexic has trouble with sight words, they have trouble with spelling, and they have trouble with sounding things out. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. What that's saying is that it's a deficit in phonological component and the ability to associate phonemes with letters or symbols. And it says it's unexpected in relation to the cognitive abilities in classroom instruction. What this means is the person's very intelligent and they've been given a good education and they still can't read well. Secondary consequences of dyslexia may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So this is very interesting and very important, the secondary consequences of dyslexia. So if somebody is not able to read very well, it takes them a long time, or it's very hard, or perhaps they can't read at all, they have, they have this, what has actually been referred to before as a print deficiency. They're not reading very much because it's difficult for them. So they don't work on skills like reading comprehension. They don't learn vocabulary and the background information that the rest of us would take in from all of this reading. And the best way to counteract that is to read to a dyslexic person. So when I work with my dyslexic students, we always put aside 10 minutes at the end of the lesson where I read to them from a book that they love to hear and they understand and they can predict and make connections and find themes and all of these deep understanding when I read to them. But they would never be able to read this book on their own just because it's too high level for where they're at the time. And my students love to be read to because it gives them a chance to learn new concepts and new words and work on their reading comprehension without having to go through the labor of sounding out every single letter on the page. Before we finish, one more thing I'd like to show you is some famous dyslexic people over on the right side. There are lots of them, more than just these guys here. I still remember explaining to a student once what dyslexia was, and he looked a little bit worried, like maybe people were going to judge him for this, or he was going to have to go in a different classroom or something. And when I told him Steven Spielberg, who made Jurassic Park, was dyslexic, all his worries went out the window. He was so proud to be like Steven Spielberg. That really made a difference for him. There are lots of very successful people who are dyslexic. 10 to 20% of people are dyslexic. In fact, 20% is 1 out of 5. So that's quite a lot of people who have dyslexia. But of course, like anything else, there's sort of a spectrum or a range. Some people are very severely dyslexic and may never learn to read, even with intense remediation. Other people may never even need any sort of remediation, and they can just with repeated practice get better, and maybe they won't ever be the fastest reader or the best speller, but they'll do just fine in school. There's a spectrum, but they say between 1 in 10 and 1 in 5 people are dyslexic. And interestingly, while a lot of dyslexic people are successful business owners and millionaires and billionaires and actors and writers and producers, a lot of dyslexic people also end up getting into trouble because they're highly intelligent, but they don't succeed in school. They can't take those regular paths to success. And some studies have found that up to 80 or 90% of the prison population is dyslexic. I thought that was very interesting, that while 10 to 20% of the general population is dyslexic, it's up to 80 or 90% of the prison population. All right, time for our summary. Feel free to turn this off if you want. I see it cut off my line at the bottom, but we'll make it work. Chapter 7 summary. Cognition is thinking, including perception, learning, problem-solving, judgment, and memory. Cognitive psychology is the field of psychology dedicated to studying every aspect of how people think. A concept is a category or grouping of linguistic information, objects, ideas, or life experiences. A prototype is the best representation of the concept. Remember that chair that we thought of when I said chair? A schema is a mental construct consisting of a cluster or collection of related concepts altogether, such as a role schema, which is a set of expectations that define the behaviors of a person, and an event schema, which is a set of behaviors that are performed the same way each time, also referred to as a cognitive script. Remember, the event schema is like when you go into an elevator, you press the button and face the front, or when you go to a birthday party, you drop off the gift and say hello and don't expect cake until later. Those are event schemas. Language is a communication system that involves using words and systematic rules to transmit information from one individual to another. Language uses lexicon, which are the words or the vocabulary. It uses grammar, the set of rules used to convey meaning through the use of lexicon. Our lexicon are made up of phonemes, which are sounds that cannot be broken down into smaller sounds, and of morphemes, which are combined phonemes, creating the smallest unit of language with meaning. Syntax is the grammar or the way that the words are organized into sentences, and semantics are the meanings of the morphemes and words themselves. Babbling is what small babies do when they repeat syllables over and over, practicing their speech and becoming more complex over time. And overgeneralization is when somebody, probably a child or somebody learning a new language, applies a grammatical rule to the exceptions, like calling mice mouses or saying I swimmed instead of I swam. An algorithm is a type of problem-solving strategy characterized by a specific set of instructions. When you have a problem and you Google how to solve it, you likely find an algorithm, instructions on how to solve your problem. A heuristic is more of a mental shortcut that saves time when solving a problem, but can lead to some errors sometimes. And trial and error is the most common problem-solving strategy in which multiple solutions are attempted until the correct one is found. Moving to the right side now, a mental set is when we continually use an old solution to a problem without getting good results, but yet we keep on trying. Functional fixedness is the inability to see an object as useful for any other use than the one for which it was intended, right? When we never thought about using the hammer as a paperweight, only as a hammer, that's functional fixedness. Hindsight bias is the belief that the event just experienced was predictable, even though it really wasn't. Remember, hindsight bias is when we say, I knew that was going to happen all along. Representative bias is related to stereotypes, when you stereotype someone or something without a valid basis for this judgment. And anchoring bias is when you fixate on a single aspect of a problem, trying to find a solution. Of course, this can be problematic. The availability heuristic is when you make a decision based on the information that's readily available to you. Something that stands out in your memory or happened recently can really influence how you make a decision now, and this can be problematic. And finally, the confirmation bias, where you focus on information that already confirms your beliefs. This is something that's very common in humans, and I'm guilty of it too, and we need to watch out for that confirmation bias, especially when reading current events or watching the news. Crystallized intelligence is acquired knowledge and the ability to retrieve it. All of our acquired knowledge that's in there is our crystallized intelligence, something that we know how to do or that we already know. Fluid intelligence is the ability to see complex relationships and solve problems. So fluid intelligence isn't something you already know, it's the intelligence you're using to solve a problem as you go. Two different theories of intelligence. One is the triarchic theory of intelligence, which tells us there are three facets of intelligence: practical, creative, and analytical. The multiple intelligence theory tells us that there are at least 8 different types of intelligence: visual, musical, kinesthetic, linguistic, mathematical, naturalistic, interpersonal, and intrapersonal. I suggest you learn the different types of intelligence. Creativity is the ability to generate, create, or discover new ideas, solutions, and possibilities. Convergent thinking provides correct or established answers to problems. Think of worksheets, one right answer. Divergent thinking, thinking outside the box. Your ideas are diverging, spreading all over the place. You're thinking outside the box to arrive at new solutions to a problem. And finally, in regards to our intelligence testing and the bell curve, we'll quickly talk about norming, which is when you administer a test to a large population so that data can be collected to reference the normal scores for a population and its group. This was done for the intelligence tests, and that's why we have normal scores for different ages. But remember that it wasn't normed with people of color. It was normed pretty much with white people, and that is one of the big problems with our intelligence tests. And they're also standardized tests, which standardization is the method of testing in which administration, scoring, and interpretation of results are consistent. So the intelligence tests are standardized and normed, but of course there's there's racial considerations here, and then of course the ethical considerations of sterilizing or putting to death people because or not because of their intelligence, which of course can be problematic.